Welcome to the Achieve Workplace Culture podcast, where Wendy, Chris, and Eric explore the latest news stories, their work, and trends for creating and maintaining a healthy workplace culture.
Welcome to the 36th episode of the Achieve Workplace Culture podcast, where we talk about all things workplace culture. And we try to explore some of the ideas and practices and sometimes articles and books that we're encountering, that we're seeing here at our workplace and in the workplaces where we're often invited in, and trying to learn from that and share some of our own experiences, questions, and insights with our listeners. And so today we thought that we would dive into this question of how do we handle mistakes? What do you do when you make a mistake, you see a mistake, somebody comes to you, there's been a mistake in the workplace, and think about that from the perspective of what kind of culture do we want anyway when it comes to mistakes, and where do we go with that stuff? But first, let me just check in and say, how you both doing? Wendy, Chris?
Yeah, I'm doing really well. Last week, Chris and I were out at a conference. So it was a lot of networking and meeting people and talking about our services, which was really exciting. And this week, it's nice to be in the office and have the time to focus on projects.
Yeah, that was great. It was and a lot of time in the car. So some good conversation
Yes.
and good discussion. And it's great to meet lots of folks. I'm doing great this morning. I just have to say, last night we had my wife and I had some friends over that were lifelong friends. And we had a Winnipeg moment occur when I was talking to a friend of mine, talking about who I'm working with now. It turns out he's roommates with one of the staff here. He was roommates with one of our staff here. It was just one of those
That's
moments
great.
where the world
Oh,
just got
that's
smaller
wild.
and smaller.
Yes.
It's like, wow, that's awesome. So yeah, doing great.
Nice. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about how mistakes were made. We're going to finish the podcast with a couple of rants and raves. And just as a bit of a prelude to that, we're going to talk about a roller skate dancer as one of our raves today. So stay
Yeah, so
tuned for
hang on.
that.
Hang on to
That's
that,
going to
yep.
be an interesting one. What does roller skate dancing have to do with workplace culture? Well, we're going to see if we can connect the dots toward the end of our podcast today. First, I want to start with a story. We were talking yesterday as we got ready for our podcast about mistakes we've made in workplaces. And I was thinking back to about 30 years ago when I was working at a factory where we took vehicles and made them nicer. Like we put in fancy seats or running boards, things like that. And I remember one day my boss said, "There's a new shipment of leather seats, Eric. Can you go open that box and carry that leather seat, over to where it needs to be installed?" Yep, no problem. I walked over to the big box and I reached down with my utility knife and I went across the tape across the top of the box and I opened the box and there was about a 6 or 8 inch long cut through the leather of the back of this seat. And my
I'm
heart
feeling for you.
went, oh no, like a just sinking feeling, right? Like, oh no. I mean, and back 30 years ago, this seat was probably several $100 seat. I was probably making about $6 an hour. I knew that for me to pay for my mistake, well, I couldn't. I mean, maybe it would come out of my check. I was stressed. And I'll never forget what happened after when my boss walked over and he said, "Ooh, why don't you take that over to Stan and see if he can fix that?" Stan was our leather worker, took the seat over to Stan, and Stan turned that cut into something that was not even visible to the naked eye. I couldn't believe it. The seat got installed and we continued on.
Wow.
And for 30 years, I have been hyper careful about how I open cardboard boxes. And nobody ever said to me, "Boy, Eric, that was sure stupid." I said it inside a lot, but nobody ever said that to me. I figured it out.
Yeah, that's a great example of learning from a mistake and learning from your leader's example. I had a similar experience, but with a blouse I had ordered online and I cut through it. Nobody needed to chastise me for that. The lesson was learned in the action itself. And I think your leader gave a great example of how to respond when mistakes are made. I mean, I think there's a more nuanced way that we can elaborate on how we respond to mistakes. But the first thing we should be asking and taking note of is, how is the other person doing? You know, you talked about being stressed. And I think when people are anxious in their workplace, everybody makes mistakes. And as soon as you make a mistake, you're going to feel a level of, ooh, is it okay to talk about this?
Yeah.
Is it okay to share it? Do I need to hide it? How are my coworkers? How's my manager going to respond? So recognizing that level of anxiety that people are going to have when they make a mistake, and that we all want to look good to our coworkers and especially to our bosses.
Yeah.
I agree. What I find really interesting about the story, because hearing what you're saying, you're absolutely right, Wendy. You want to be considerate of how might someone be feeling. But I'm also wondering that individual, what was their name? You don't have to say their last name. Just hear you remember what their name was?
No, I don't even
Okay.
remember.
Okay. I was just
mean,
curious.
I
feel like
know,
you should,
I know who owned the business,
Okay.
but I don't remember which of the two bosses came to me
we'll
that
say
day.
Joe was
Sure.
the person. I wonder if Joe even stopped to think about how you were feeling. Probably not.
Probably not.
It was how Joe responded is the beauty to that story. And I also wonder if, I mean, the way I hear it, it's almost like Joe didn't respond as if it was a mistake
No.
necessarily. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
which just led to this amazing experience that, seeing as you're telling us the story, it's probably shaped not just how you cut boxes, but
Oh,
probably
yeah.
how you respond when you see an incident occur.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because I remember how I felt
Right.
in that moment, you know, mortified, embarrassed,
Mm.
afraid, worried. Like there was just this flood of like, oh no, I created all this damage
Sure.
and I can't pay for it.
Yeah.
And ever since then, when somebody's come to me and said, Eric, I made a mistake and it's going to cost the company, I just say, don't worry about it.
Right.
We all make mistakes.
Yeah.
Because I know people are worrying
Sure.
about it. We'll,
Yeah.
we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, absolutely. It
And
shapes me
that's-
still.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I think just that alone, and I think it speaks to what you were saying, Wendy. I as I'm thinking about this as a leader, we don't want to get too caught up in what they might think. I think we can just assume if something's occurred, there's probably a lot going on.
Yeah.
And I think that response of however it comes out, it'll be okay. It's kind of what we all need to hear when something goes wrong in a believable way. And that can just kind of calm you down, regulate you, and move you on. That's
Yeah.
a really powerful story.
It really is. It really is. And I think what we're talking about here is reframing mistakes as potentially a very valuable learning
Sure.
opportunity for us. I mean,
Yeah.
I think there are some mistakes that are avoidable
Sure.
Sure.
that we don't need to make,
Yeah.
you know, and mistakes that we want to be careful and safeguard against, like stepping against and working against our values and our culture. I mean, following processes that are laid out very clearly and intentionally not following the process.
Right.
But for the most part, that's the minority. People want to do well in their job. So when mistakes are made, to reframe it as, hey, what are we going to learn here
Yeah.
and take away from this? So it means we actually have to stop and say, okay, what happened here? What led to this mistake? So you didn't know that when you cut that box open, that
No.
the leather was close to the top of the box.
No clue.
That was not part of your training, or that was not communicated to you. So there's an element of, well, how could you have known that?
Right. So one would say, was it even a mistake? Ultimately, it was a
Sure.
thing. Like, I mean,
It was a thing.
well,
was a
no,
thing. I like
that's it. Like,
Yeah, it was a thing.
If you really think about this, you said, what did you say at the beginning? A mistake happens, and it wasn't. I didn't do it. When it was
Mistakes were made, but not by me. Like people,
right.
people try to
Okay.
avoid
So
that.
in that moment, that thing that happened to you, something happened. I mean, I know on the surface we can go, well, that was a mistake. You shouldn't have done that. But as you mentioned, Wendy, did you know how these boxes are packed? Did you, there's so many things. And if there was a mistake that was made in that situation, not even knowing the
Right.
whole moment, I'm just going to take a bit of a guess at this. The mistake actually occurred long before the thing,
Yes.
It's so true, right?
right?
Yeah, because why
Or-
didn't anybody orient me toward
Yeah.
how to keep the leather
Right.
seats safe, right? Why didn't anyone ever even just say, hey, you're going to be asked to open a lot of packages here.
Right.
When you open a
Yeah.
package, do it this way.
We have some really, delicate material. But I wonder, let's bring this to the context of leadership and even culture.
Mm-hmm.
That idea, a mistake is made but not by me.
Mm-hmm.
Who? And this is a heavy kind of, perhaps, well, the burden's there already on leaders. But when you observe something happening in the workplace,
Yeah.
cutting a box that way, or even as you mentioned, Wendy, maybe behaving in a way that's out of step with their values. It's almost natural for us to go, well, why did they do it that way? And they've made a mistake. But what we've observed is a thing occur.
A thing, yes. And we need to ask a question and figure out what's going on underneath the
Right.
water. What's happening there?
Yeah, right.
And when you were talking about, your boss responding in a positive way, you didn't know that would actually
Yeah.
cause damage. I think in a leadership role, we often know what we know and we think it's very
So
intuitive. We take
obvious.
it for
well,
granted.
they should have
Right.
known.
They should have known. I mean,
Right.
I'm thinking as you were
Yeah.
sharing that story of when my children started taking violin lessons, we show up to the lesson, the violin teacher would tune the instrument, and then we'd go home. And over the course of the week, the instrument would get like
Sound
out
terrible.
of sound terrible.
Yeah.
So I'd call my neighbor and I would play the strings to her over the phone, and she would
No
tell me
way.
which way to move the pegs to tune. We did this for a full year.
Mhm.
And one day in the lesson, the teacher noted that, hey, it's more tuned this week than it's ever been. I said, yeah, I called my neighbor and I shared what I was doing. And they were
Right.
like, oh, you need to buy a tuner? There's a process involved in this.
Right.
You should be doing this every day. You do not need to call your neighbor and do this. Oh, well, I didn't know.
Don't know.
How
Right.
would I have known
Yeah.
that?
Right.
So it wasn't a lack of wanting to do well. It was a lack of being coached and taught.
As you're saying this, when I'm thinking about this, and I keep kind of bringing it back into the workplace leadership
Mhm.
and how that affects culture, because that's what we talk about. However, I'm thinking it's on a grander scale, how even in that moment, how that person responded to you can shape so much about your experience with that individual.
Right.
Like how you felt coming out of that. Because we've probably all had those moments where we've done something that should have been obvious.
Yeah.
We've been left feeling a little embarrassed, maybe. And it's like someone said, well, you should have known. Can't believe you didn't know that. Or they just approached it that way and you just felt good about that experience and probably then had an influence. I'm going back to your story, Eric.
Yeah.
That moment,
Mm.
like I said, as you've said, definitely shaped how you open boxes. But beyond that, and we talked about this yesterday, you're really good at, I've made a mistake.
Mhm.
You're quick to own it.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's other influences that have led to how you
Mhm.
behave this way, but surely that's one of them. Is that
Mhm.
fair to say that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, when you start to experience not being punished
Yeah,
for making a mistake,
sure.
then it's easier to own it the next
Absolutely.
time, right?
Yes.
And I also really realize the higher up you are in an organization, well, maybe this isn't true, but let's riff on this a little bit. Is it easier to own your mistake as you go higher up? Maybe it's harder. I'm not actually sure, but like, there's nobody to punish me anymore except
Right.
for myself.
Yeah.
Within an organization, I really feel like one of the things that organizations get wrong all the time is they treat, like, to use mistakes or things, I don't know what we call them right now, but let's say they treat mistakes as though it's something that we need to punish. And like, you can take the
Right.
physical thing, the physical act of opening a box with a knife, and a person could go, that was stupid. Like, you should have known better.
Mhm.
We're going to take 10% of the price of that seat out of your wages so you learn.
Right.
Well, I don't need that to learn,
Yeah.
but somebody could think I
Yeah.
need that to learn. That's a very physical act. And I think a lot of people are quite forgiving of like making a physical mistake. But what about social mistakes? We also make social mistakes. Maybe we
That's
didn't
very
live out
true.
of value in the way that others think that we should have lived it out in a workplace. And why are we less forgiving of that? I wonder.
Mhm.
Because we all need to learn. One of the things that, like, do you as a leader or an organization want to be right, or do you want to learn?
Yes.
Right. And I think sometimes when we get the I'm right, you're wrong, this, like, I'm going to judge what you've done and I'm going to now try to hold you accountable through punishment.
Yes.
We don't create learning, we create avoidance.
Eric, I feel very strongly about that. And the idea of disciplining or punishing people so that they learn. I think society is changing in how they perceive how children learn. But yet somehow in the workplace, we still feel the freedom to discipline, progressive
Well, you have
discipline,
policies
and there's
around it. Yes.
policies
Yeah.
around that. I don't know. I don't believe that that's the best way that we create an environment of learning
Right.
to move forward. And I think you're right. The idea of values, when people socially misstep, we tend to be a little more, is judgmental the right
Judgmental, sure,
word
yeah.
around that? I think that always, no matter whether it's behavioral or process or task or project, mistakes are made that we want to
Right.
figure out and have a conversation around that. But when there's repeated
Yeah.
value in,
Incongruence.
leaning incongruence, that's a
Yeah.
great word, Chris, then it might not be the right alignment with the work
Sure.
environment. But yes, you're very right. We are, and those are the harder conversations
are.
to have,
You
I
know,
think.
Yeah, I fully agree. And there's so much of what you said there, Eric. It really got me thinking. Is it easier to admit mistakes the higher up you go or
Right.
not? And I'm going to suggest it is. Because just think about this. I mean, it also depends on who you are and what your experiences have
And
been. Some
what your
people might
team's
really
like around
struggle with
you.
that, and
Yeah.
for a good reason. Maybe they've had some terrible experiences around that. But when you just think about our systems that we have,
Mhm.
a CEO or a vice president of whatever makes a mistake, an error. When was the last time you heard someone go, let's check the progressive discipline policy
Right.
around that error? Now, I'm barring like big ethical moves in an
Sure,
organization,
sure,
just a
sure.
fundamental mistake that's made. But yet, on the front line,
Uh-huh.
one of the first things we do when a thing occurs, the box gets cut, where do we document this? How do we do this? Do we doc pay? And I'm taking some liberties with this, but I'd say it's much easier to make a mistake and admit to it on a more senior level, because even though a mistake might have far more devastating consequences, we're almost more forgiving than on the front line. And odds are that error that's occurred at that senior level, we say a mistake occurred, it's not, it's not I didn't do it. It probably is more linked to that. Whereas in the front line, that really is more of a things occurred that you're on the receiving end of this, but the mistake probably occurred 10 steps down previous, which is
right.
you didn't get the training.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm
I think it's maybe easier as the higher up you are in an organization to admit a mistake
sure.
because the repercussions are less. But I don't know that that's actually reflected in the behavior of leaders. I think
Right.
because a lot of organizations are looking to correct mistakes and think about how are we going to be, discipline and root out the
Yeah.
mistakes, that they don't verbalize or aren't vulnerable with their mistakes because they don't want to seem like they're giving leniency to their staff to make mistakes
Right.
themselves.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I just read a study this last weekend that said 85% of staff
Mhm.
are not comfortable approaching their boss or manager and having a straightforward conversation around even ideas that are half-baked or mistakes that they have made, because they don't want to look poor with their coworkers,
Sure.
and they really don't
Sure.
want to look poorly in front of someone who has some ability to write them up, to put the file in the folder.
Well, that's important, Wendy. So let's think about that for a moment. If we even think about whether or not leaders do admit mistakes, I think again, I'm taking some liberties. It's a little easier
Yeah.
to do because the conditions are such that makes it a little safer to be able to do that. On perhaps the front line, if you know you're going to get written up or, something punitive is going to some sort of punishment, well, show me a human being that's not going to go, do I put this forward? It's a natural
Right.
instinct to just,
I want to
I don't
avoid
feel
punishment.
safe. I'm going to
right.
protect myself.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe we should talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit, about what are those conditions that are required in order for someone
And
to
yet,
bring something forward.
and yeah, exactly. Because if we can't learn from our mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them.
Right.
Right. If we can't, as an organization, understand what's not working right, we're doomed to repeat it. If we can't, we have to build the system to make it safe. And one of the questions is so if 85% of people don't feel, I don't know if the word's safe, but they wouldn't approach their boss with a half-baked idea or a mistake.
Yeah, they just wouldn't.
They wouldn't, right? So that impoverishes the organization.
Yeah.
And that's the leader's fault. I mean, it's also somewhat the fault of our culture, but it's also the leader's fault, and leaders, plural, fault, in the sense that, and maybe fault finding isn't the right thing to do, but I feel like
Responsibility
this
lays there.
responsibility lies
Yes,
there.
it's
Thank you.
well
That's a
said,
better
well
way to
said,
put it.
yeah.
The responsibility lies there because, and like, I want us to be open when something doesn't work right, because I just want to learn from it.
Sure.
Like, I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
want anyone to be punished when something doesn't work right. I just want to learn from it and fix it. Like,
And-
and I want, like, so we have some people that do the same kind of job. We have, a team of 5 people. They all do this roughly the same thing. If one of them makes an error, mistake, a thing happens with, say, a contract that goes to a client, and it costs the organization $1,000, I would much rather them share it with their team and say, oops, and the team problem solve and go, oh, maybe I'm at risk of making the same error. How do we prevent this in the
Right.
future? Rather than that person feel like they need to hide it.
Yeah.
And then that's being hidden as makes more mistakes are happening because we can't learn from it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. And I know that we've talked about this in a previous podcast, but the study that Amy Edmondson looked at
Mhm.
around nurses and highly
Right.
skilled teams actually reported more mistakes than lower skilled teams. And they anticipated that it would be the other way around. Skills that are teams that are performing well, they should have less mistakes. Well, that's not really true.
Right.
They're learning from them. They're reporting them. They're talking about them really quickly. They're trying to change their processes. And it does. You're impoverished. You're not learning from the mistakes.
Mhm.
Right.
And you also put your organization at risk. If I have a workaround that's taking supplies from another department
Yeah.
to, help myself in the middle of a crisis, that department somewhere downstream is going to notice that and feel the impact of that. So we're not improving.
Right.
We're putting other departments, other people at risk.
Right.
It's so impoverishing our ability to move forward.
So then in that, Wendy, what were the characteristics of those less skilled teams that were doing better? What was going on there?
Oh,
that
they
led
had
to-
lots of workarounds. So they made a mistake or the process didn't quite work for them. They thought it wasn't as streamlined as it could be.
Yeah.
They just did things behind the scenes and figured out their own way to do things.
Okay.
One of the examples around workarounds was if they were low on linens, they, would go to the next department or next shift and take it from the other
From
Okay.
the other team.
from the other team. And then, but they didn't necessarily report it. It was just, it's just a blanket or two. We need it right now. We'll take it in. We'll use it.
Mhm.
Well, that has a downstream effect.
Okay.
Right.
Right. Sure it does. I was curious. Are we saying that's a good thing or a
No,
bad
that's
thing? Yes,
not a
okay.
good thing.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah,
the
we're
wrong
not.
behavior gets created because of those workarounds.
Yeah.
But so where I'm going with this, what
What-
was the contributing factors to the teams that were working well together? What?
And could share their mistakes.
Well, first of all, it was a mindset from leaders who actually reframe what mistakes are. They're
Right.
learning opportunities. We want them to be shared as quickly as possible so we
Right.
can figure out what's going on.
Right.
That it's safe to say them. Lots of questions
Right.
asked when things don't work. People feel like the process, the quality of what they're doing matters so much
Right.
that they're
Yeah.
not going to personalize a air quote mistake
Sure.
that happens.
So you said something really important there. There was a high level of safety.
Very.
Let's talk
yes.
about that because I think that's
Psychological
let's go
safety.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do we create a no fear organization would be another way to think about
Yeah.
that, because it's the fear that prevents me.
right. Sure.
Right. So how do we create that safety? How do we create a no fear place? What are some practical things that you've either experienced personally that led to a reduction in fear or you've seen other managers do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I personally think leaders go first in this situation. And Eric, I know I've shared this with you before. When I was new in my role and was going to walk into yours, I distinctly remember one meeting where you called myself and another one of our coworkers into your office and you said, "Hey, I've double booked myself for this important event. I'm not quite sure how to manage this. Let's problem solve together." And I remember leaving that day and going, "Whew, this is
Oh,
going to be
yeah.
a good place to work,"
Right.
because I anticipate I'm going to be in that same situation. And I've got a team of people around to support me and to help me think about when I make a mistake, when things don't go as planned. This is a safe place to talk about that.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I love that when leaders go first. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we want to be mindful of the environment in which people are working with, and even let's put it this way. I trust that all of our staff here are honest people that don't withhold information, intentionally. And if there were a situation where something was withheld, I would have to think about, well, what's going on in the environment that might lead this person to do this? I think so often when a thing happens, we're quick to call it a mistake and we go to the individual around what did they do wrong, when we actually really need to be mindful of the environment they're in. And we were talking about this yesterday. You really can't separate an individual from their environment. It's going to influence how they behave when they're there. So often, I think leaders need to go first. I agree that's setting permission, but also when a thing happens, as leaders, we need to, before we even suggest a mistake's been made, do some reflection. Is there something about the environment or maybe something around what we've done? Yeah, before, because one of the things I'll suggest is that most of the time, not all of the time, when some sort of thing occurs that might even be performance related, it's probably not at the root cause a mistake that's been made by the employee.
Yeah,
it's
it
probably
might
tied back to something else.
lack of knowledge, not clear expectations,
Right.
Lack of experience.
lack of experience. They're learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we call them errors. I don't know.
Things, technically speaking.
I got this thing that has water in it, Chris. Is it the same thing?
Well, and I think asking lots of questions around when things happen to figure out what's going on and showing a curiosity and demonstrating that, hey, we're going to learn from this. And I also think, I mean, we work in lots of project-based, we're involved in lots of projects in our organization. I think encouraging people to share the process, not just celebrating the end result, but how things are moving along and having a conversation. Oh, why are you doing it this way? How do you think this is going to land? I wonder about that. So that we don't think that, or people don't come to believe that it's only the finished product of the best quality that matters. It's like input, effort, learning along the way is what we should be affirming as well.
What have you learned along the way? That's a really important question. And the word curiosity just came up too. And I think that the way we are curious matters. Sometimes we just say, well, we need to shift our judgment to curiosity, but how do you do that practically? Because one kind of curious question is, who's at fault? I'm curious who's at fault here, but it's the wrong kind of curiosity because it's a curiosity that seeks blame and fault finding. Instead, I think it's more important to ask the question, what happened?
Right.
And what are you learning, or what are we learning? And how will this change our work going forward? And so it's not, I don't care who's at fault. I care about what happened and what that experience taught us and what that's going to change about how we go forward. That's the thing I should be caring about as a leader or manager of a team.
Yeah, I agree. Not to challenge what you were saying, Wendy, you said ask lots of questions. It's ask the right questions. In some cases, not lots of them, because sometimes even that can almost be a bit of a Gatling gun of like interrogation. Like, oh, I don't know.
Why did you do it that way?
I think when we think, I'll put this in the context of leadership. I think it applies in life here. This is a really critical moment. Something has happened. That thing, that error, that whatever. How we respond in that critical moment carries a completely disproportionate weight on the experience someone has of us. So those are the times as leaders, as people with responsibility for others, we need to quickly make sure we self-assess before we engage. Even though we're trying to be curious, are we going into that in the clearest state possible? Because so much, you had that great story about the box cutting, but I'm sure we can get into many, many stories where with the opposite and the influence that had. That of all of the things you want to get right as a leader is how you respond when something unexpected has occurred. Because that's really where your values come to play and not. And I think we need to make sure that sometimes in our response to an error, we might be frustrated, and that frustration actually might not have to do with the employee, but they get on the receiving end of that and they have a negative experience. They're not owning it next time,
Mhm.
right? And we're contributing to an environment
Yep.
where people don't own their mistakes, even though they might at home. When they
Right.
come into this environment, now people are keeping stuff. The culture really, really matters that we shape that.
Yeah,
It really does.
You're right. The leader's response is going to shape culture there, and it's going to create safety or not safety
Right.
going
Yeah.
forward.
And I think we should share our lack of knowledge or the mistakes that we made. I just had a conversation before I walked in with one of our team managers, and she was saying someone on her team didn't know about a particular process. She had shared this. Was there anything else that she could have done? She was coming to me for a bit of feedback on her response to someone on her team. And I said, well, it sounds great in terms of you gave her all the information she needed. But don't forget that she came forward and asked you. And the learning that you passed along to her, that should be shared within the team.
Yeah.
So, in your next team meeting, it might be helpful to celebrate that this individual came
question.
forward
That's
with
it.
this particular instance. And this, you learn as a team, they can learn from that experience.
Mhm.
What,
And
do,
that's
what do we
celebrated.
recognize and celebrate? I think that's a key piece. As you're
Mhm.
saying that, I couldn't help but think my daughter, you don't remember what grade it was, but it was a new teacher she had no experience with before. And this individual said, I love mistakes. You
Oh.
set the tone right at the beginning of the year.
Nice.
And my daughter was one that she'd be nervous if she made a mistake. And now she's back with this teacher this year, right? This 4 years later. And that trust and that connection is so clear. But what it was they celebrated mistakes and made it okay.
Right.
So we're celebrating the right things here. In this case, like you're saying, someone brought it up. Let's actually celebrate that. Because that's really the awesomeness of that story. And then we
Yeah.
can learn from it. It creates opportunity. So what do we celebrate and what do we recognize? So important.
Mhm. Mhm. So let's last thought from each of us on the topic of mistakes were made by not by me, and then let's get into our rants and raves.
Okay.
Mistakes are a powerful learning opportunity.
Mhm.
And we should reframe what we call a mistake. It's a thing.
That's a thing.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I fully support that. I also think we need to be mindful of the environment in which we're operating in, because we could tell people to just own your mistakes here, but we have a whole collection of human beings coming into our workplace that have had a whole let's play that scenario, Eric. In your workplace, had it gone another way,
Yeah.
and you were berated for that mistake, probably less likely to own a mistake. So we want to be mindful of that. While we might want people to own mistakes in this environment, they might have a different experience coming in. So we need to meet employees where they're at. And it's through those things we talk about, celebrating things, living out values. So they start to feel comfortable and safe in the environment where, you know what, maybe my default externally is not to own my mistakes because if I've had those experiences, but I know in here, I'm safe. I'm
Yeah.
okay to do it. And I have to share this story. I know we're in a final thought, but I was thinking about myself even coming to work here at Achieve and CTRI when we were in discussions about that. One of the things that really helped me make my decision was this. I reflected on any time I've been asked to do something with this organization, even if it was last minute, I just do it. I don't hold back because I'm not afraid of, if it doesn't go well, what's the consequences? Because the conditions are such that if I made a mistake, that's okay. We'll get through this. Where in other environments, I would perhaps hold back. Should we do this? And I would be second guessing everything. So for me, that's an environment. So it's same individual
Right.
having two very
Yeah.
different experiences due to the environment,
Right.
right? So the environment matters. That's my final thought, would be the environment matters. We need to tend to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that. So for me, I really think about, bringing this back to culture. What's the culture we want to
Yeah.
create? I want to create a culture where people feel safe, psychologically safe enough to say, when I make an error, when something doesn't go the way I expected, when I think there's going to be a cost to the organization, that experience and the learning that comes from that's going to be celebrated, not punished.
Right.
And I think, like a little catchphrase for me is no punishment, no humiliation,
Yeah.
only learning, right? Like that's it,
Mhm.
right? No punishment, no humiliation, only learning. What are we going to learn? What are we going to do? It's fine. Like there are no catastrophic mistakes, or very few in organizations. Almost everything can be a win once you've figured out what you've learned. And so that's the way. I hope our listeners are thinking that way too. And if our listeners are in an organization where they are surrounded by people that are protective, self-protective, and not willing to own what's going on, my hope is that they can start to shift the tone through simple practices of themselves, not blaming others, not humiliating others, instead celebrating what they see as opportunities to learn and grow, and talking with their colleagues and their coworkers and their managers to say, what do we really want? Do we want to be right, or do we want to grow and thrive?
Yeah.
Because we can go down one of those paths.
Yeah.
Let's
Are we
choose the right path.
playing to win, or
Yeah.
are we playing to not lose? I think that's a big distinction you're talking
Yes.
about there.
Eric, there's so much profundity to what you said there, and even mentioned it before. Even if the mistake's catastrophic, is punishment, is humiliation necessary? No. Like,
Yeah.
probably all the more learning opportunity. So I think that is absolutely the approach we should take on all things. Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing.
All right. So I promised to our listeners that we would talk about the dancing roller skater. We're at that part of our show that we normally call rants and raves. This is a little bit different than our usual rant and rave. But Chris, why don't you tell us a bit about the rave you have about the dancing roller
so
skater?
it's interesting. We always will chat about, do we have a rant or a rave? And I'm usually quick to jump on a rant of some kind. And just in thinking about this, I have a rave. And for listeners that wouldn't know our environment, I think this actually speaks to our environment. Just outside our office window, almost on a daily basis, there's an individual that is on roller skates, listening to music, dancing. And it makes me so happy to see. Because I remember the first time I saw it, I'm like, well, that was admittedly a bit odd. But then I saw it again. And then even today walking in, just before this cast, she's out there, and it just made me feel good. So my rave is just a thank you to this person for being out doing the dancing. And what I love about it, what I observed today was, it makes me feel good. I know within the office, some other folks will see that happening, and it is celebrated. But what I also saw this morning was someone was out walking their dog and just said good morning to the dancing roller skater. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is celebrate your community and its quirks. Because if someone was to be on the outside looking at what just spun out, concluding with the roller skate, but what was occurring, it would look weird. It would look strange. It was not strange. It was comforting. It was beautiful, really. So just my rave is thanks to the dancing roller skater.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's such a great story. And it kind of links to where Eric started with his story about cutting the box,
Right.
that people impact each other in ways that we don't always realize.
Mhm.
And in those small moments, we can have a positive impact on people we're directly working with, but
Mhm.
also on the periphery, like the dancing roller skater.
Right.
She's bringing a little bit of joy to our work environment. It's one of our values. And at coffee break, we look out the window and go, hey, everyone take a moment, look at the dancing roller skater, because
And celebrate it.
and
Yeah.
celebrate that. There's
good.
goodness to be found if we pay attention and look outside.
It got me thinking a little bit about what do we look for,
Look,
or how do we interpret what we see? You can look out our windows. You can also see garbage on the ground.
Yes.
And you can see a mural, but sometimes you can see graffiti, and you can see someone dancing on roller skates in front of her apartment
Right.
building. And you can see the person dancing on roller skates, and you can go, that's weird, have a bit of a judgmental thought, or I wonder what's wrong with her. Or you can say, isn't that beautiful?
Right.
There's lots of different ways we can approach it. And I feel like when we look around at the world in our offices, let's bring this back to our offices and culture, and we see quirky things, we can celebrate or we can judge, just like we can with errors and mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Or we can celebrate and we go, that's neat. That just makes me happy that
Sure.
that person likes that strange thing on their desk. I don't know. it's fine. There's no
Yeah.
judgment, right? Like it's good.
And we can intentionally choose the lens that we want to see the world and our workplace through.
That's right.
Absolutely.
So we're come to the end of our show. And that means that Chris is going to take us out with some summarization of some of the key points that our listeners can take away and try to reflect on and implement in their workplace. So take us away, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric and Wendy. That was, as always, a great conversation. I have so many thoughts swimming through my head or swimming around in my head about what we just discussed. But I had a few key takeaways for me. It was right back to something Eric said early on is, do you want an organization that's right or an organization that learns and thrives? There's a big difference. If we want to be learning and thriving, we need to approach issues as they occur with curiosity, not with our judgment, so we can learn from them. And in order to really to create an environment where this is going to happen, leaders need to go first. Leaders need to make sure that we're setting the tone, that it's okay to admit errors when they occur, so we can learn from them. But how, as leaders, we respond when something occurs is critical, and that is a critical moment that really makes or breaks the leadership experience that someone is having. So we really want to get that right. So create the conditions by first leading the way. But when something occurs, I love what Eric said, no punishment, no humiliation, only learning. If we can do that, if we can approach things as they occur, no matter how significant the error might have been, if we approach it from a learning perspective, not from a punishment perspective, not from a humiliation perspective, then we start to create the conditions for success where people can do well. No matter what's going on outside of the workplace for them, when they come in, this is an environment where I can thrive and we can grow as a collective. So much in there. And in fact, if thinking about your workplace culture and how to transform it into a healthy environment where we are learning and growing, we actually have a great resource available to you that Scott's going to upload in our show notes for you. It's a culture transformation toolkit, and in that we include a copy actually of the book that Eric and Wendy have written called "Don't Blame the Lettuce." We have some checklists for you to go through when you're thinking about the health of your workplace culture, and assessment, as well as it's jam-packed with resources to help you to assess and start to transform your culture. So that's available to you in the show notes. But also stay connected with us, folks. Feel free to check us out at theachievecenter.com, or our website, and that's Center TRE, the Canadian spelling. Lots of information and resources is there as well. Follow us on LinkedIn as well, and stay connected. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about, questions you might have. We can maybe answer those as one of our future casts. So stay connected. Most of all, folks, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and we look forward to speaking to you in the future. Have a great day.